Hundreds of feet below the desert, beneath the vast mountains of California, are the remains of what was once one of the most fruitful silver mines in America. Sitting empty, picked dry by years of mining, decaying above these tunnels are the fading memories of the origin of California's wealth, a genuine American ghost town. Buildings that once housed hundreds of people working to exploit America's natural splendor now sit empty. This is the long and strange history of Cerro Gordo, the father of modern Los Angeles, and one of the few true ghost towns in America. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. The boom and the bust is a tale as old as time in the American West. Communities, towns, even cities were born from wherever settlers found something worth mining. The mines contained the metals. Metals attracted people. And where there are people, there is work, opportunity for enterprise. And this is where something magical occurs. Imagine an abandoned scrap of borderline unlivable desert becomes a bustling community, complete with commerce, families, and construction. But the boom never lasted. There's nothing renewable about silver and gold, and as veins were depleted, the associated businesses dried up. In the grand perspective of history, as soon as towns such as Cerro Gordo flourish, they are often abandoned. The prospect for Cerro Gordo's boom began in 1865, when the first miners began extracting silver and smelting it in crude furnaces. While the quality of the silver was phenomenal, the area's native Paiute people were in constant conflict with any new settlers to the area, and with pretty justifiable reason. A spat of unseasonably cold weather and flooding in the area meant that the Paiute people lost a ton of the game they depended on for survival. Additionally, the new settlers brought cattle into the region which competed with the native wildlife that the indigenous people hunted. And so this is where relations really began to intensify. The natives, faced with starvation, saw no other option. They began killing the settlers' cattle. In turn, the settlers attempted to protect their livestock, and a period of warring began. This is when Fort Independence was established. Independence was an outpost for California and Nevada settlers to mount an offensive. While conflict would continue, the area around the landscape, Cerro Gordo included, was much safer for the American settlers than before. This safety, at the expense of Native Americans, was very enticing to American businessmen. Businessmen such as Victor Beaudry, younger brother of the mayor of Los Angeles at the time. With visions of great riches, he began constructing new, modern smelters to allow for silver production to increase. And Beaudry wasn't the only businessman attracted to Cerro Gordo. A notable New York industrialist named Belshaw moved west for the opportunity as well. He first landed in San Francisco, where he was able to achieve success with the Pacific Refinery, whose business and mining covered the whole state. Cerro Gordo was the next prize he laid his eyes upon. In 1868, he arrived to the area. Belshaw saw the potential of the mine but didn't have the funds himself, so he brought a wagon load of pure Cerro Gordo silver hundreds of miles from the mine to Los Angeles, and once in LA, he began his search for investors. He found eager moneymen and quickly formed the Union Mining Company with two partners. Together, they built the very first wagon route from Los Angeles to Cerro Gordo. By sharing safe passage through the rocky hills, this enormous effort created what became known as the Yellow Road. Despite multiple businesses operating mining claims in the region, Belshaw's Union Mining Company was the sole owner and operator of the Yellow Road, meaning that every piece of silver, gold, or lead passed from Cerro Gordo to the big city was taxed by his tolls. Rather than compete, Belshaw and Beaudry joined forces and enjoyed complete control over Cerro Gordo. Production increased to an average of 7 tons of ore being mined per day, topping out at a whopping 9 tons. The ore literally couldn't be hauled down the mountain fast enough. Union Mining's control was rock solid, and they maintained a tight hold over Cerro Gordo for many years. Cerro Gordo brought so much money to the city that the Los Angeles News wrote in 1872, "To this city, Cerro Gordo trade is invaluable. What Los Angeles now is mainly due to it. It is the silver cord that binds our present existence. Should it be unfortunately severed, we would inevitably collapse. This was the dream of the West. Riches to be won by the greatest American to show their grit. A land of opportunity for those willing to put up and move into the dangerous frontier. And as the mystique of the West gave way to the reality of greed, bloodshed, and decline, Los Angeles, the city built by Cerro Gordo, began to sell the myth of the Wild West to the world. While the mining of silver and lead had peaked in the 1880s, the needs of industry and business were changing at the same time. Cerro Gordo was able to adapt, while silver and lead created the boom that birthed the town. Zinc was also lurking in the hills. Demand for zinc increased, heading into the 20th century, and as high-grade zinc ore was discovered in the mines in 1907, industry flourished once again. By 1912, Cerro Gordo was once again on top, now as the largest producer of zinc carbonate in the United States. In 1916, the town's industrial equipment was replaced, moving from the steam-powered equipment to an electrical system. This would be the last modernization Cerro Gordo saw for a very, very long time. As the Wild West died, so did this town. The zinc boom was not nearly as profitable as the silver boom and did not have nearly as long of a life. By 1920, there were just 10 miners left at Cerro Gordo, and they were scrounging for what remained of the once renowned veins. Well, the final death of industry in the town wasn't until 1938. Cerro Gordo had long since lost its luster. While the boom can seem instantaneous, the bust is anything but. What was left behind was just a skeleton of a community. Several buildings loosely organized around several magnificent tunnel systems, remarkably preserved by the stable and dry climate of the desert. Pieces of Cerro Gordo that had stood since the beginning of industrialization remained for decades and decades. One of which I'd like to present you has only recently been lost to fire, but its memory remains a precious element of Californian history. The prominent piece of local architecture I have in mind was the American Hotel. Built in 1871, it stood tall into the turn of the millennia as the oldest standing hotel in California. This building was a pinnacle example of the American West, complete with a bullet hole in the wall. There are nearly 22 other buildings in conditions ranging from dilapidated to historically preserved, some of them with blood-stained floors, and others are claimed to be haunted. But the fact that any of these historic buildings are still usable can only really be accredited to the maintenance of the town's recent succession of owners, which brings us to probably the most unusual part of Cerro Gordo's history: ghost town enthusiasts. For some, the dream of striking it rich in Cerro Gordo never really died, so now let's meet the modern residents of Cerro Gordo. For starters, there was a former high school teacher, Robert Louis Demarize, who had spent years visiting the remote ghost town during school holidays as a hobby. He would descend hundreds of feet into the long, abandoned tunnels with nothing but a chisel and a hammer to crack the rocks and see what's behind them. Eventually, he retired from teaching and moved to the ghost town full-time to live away from society, up in the mountain and under the stars. Desmarize's wife left him up there. He says that she couldn't stand the altitude. He lived in a cabin that stood since the mining days at 8,200 feet, and his wife lived somewhere in Nevada. And after over 22 years of amateur mining, he found nothing more than, by his own count, about a wheelbarrow full of unrefined silver ore. But he always held out hope that one day he'd be the one to find the legacy, that lost vein of silver, and strike it rich, the stuff of legends. Bringing us to modern day, when after years of decay, Cerro Gordo has once again captured the imagination of Los Angeles, much in thanks to the storytelling of Brent Underwood. The idea of a genuine ghost town representing an almost mystical part of American culture is alluring to everyone, and Brent Underwood, a businessman from Texas, understands that fact. He corralled investors to turn Cerro Gordo into a tourist destination. In 2018, Underwood paid $1.4 million for 380 acres of land, as well as all of the mining claims and historic charm that comes with it. Underwood popularized this abandoned town by creating authentic videos about what it's like to live in a ghost town, including extremely dangerous tours hundreds of feet below ground and in century-old, unmaintained tunnels. The adventures are almost always fruitful, as Underwood recovers untouched artifacts such as newspaper clippings, bottles, and tools. Although he's a man of many words, one quote I came across online says it all. "I used to watch Gunsmoke as a kid," Underwood says. "My grandfather had dementia and would watch it on repeat. It's like living that childhood fantasy." Underwood's commitment to the town is almost bizarre, and it's been tested time and again. For example, on June the 15th, 2020, Underwood went to sleep in one of the cabins. He awoke at 2:45 a.m. to an explosion. A fire was burning within the American Hotel. Once the oldest hotel in the state, the American was now ablaze. Fire trucks were hours away, and any attempt to save the building was in vain. That night, 3 buildings burnt to the ground, including the hotel, which was meant to be the center attraction of Cerro Gordo. In a strange coincidence, the hotel had opened on June the 15th, 1871, and 149 years later, to the day, it was reduced to ash and dust. But this hasn't slowed Underwood down. He's vowed to rebuild and construct an artificial approximate of the hotel that was lost. And he'll probably succeed thanks to his 2.8 million fans on TikTok and 25.3 million total views. Some people might feel that as the Wild West image of California, an American Western frontier fades, another comes into focus. And it's really pretty ironic. The consumerist, image-based California, pretty much the exact opposite of the mining industry, might be the very thing that saves this ghost town. However, I'd probably take a more romantic approach to this topic, considering the millions upon millions of Americans whose ancestors worked in mines very similar to the one in Cerro Gordo, not to mention the ancestors of their ancestors who worked in mines abroad. Discovering untouched history, even through YouTube videos, is a small way of keeping one in touch with their heritage. I once had an opportunity to visit a silver mine in the middle of Europe, 9 time zones away from Cerro Gordo, and I must confess that the similarities were striking. However, unlike the vast majority of historic mines around the world, Cerro Gordo has found an unexpected new purpose in the modern age, and thanks to that, it might survive a little bit longer, or at least as long as TikTok stays in vogue. That's it for today's episode. Be sure to subscribe, share this video. For more It's History, check out our series Tales of Urban Decay, our video about New York's Lost Penn Station, and tune in for our daily stories. This is Ryan Socash, signing off.